Hello, welcome to my podcast and my YouTube channel. Today, we're going to talk about suicide grief and also religion. For those who listen to my podcast, they know that I've made an effort lately to talk about religion and different religions. We've had someone a few weeks ago talk about Christianity and suicide. Today, we're going to talk about Judaism and suicide because I know I have listeners from so many different places. Last time I checked, I had listeners from over 100, and I think it was 115 countries. So I want to cover as many religions as I can. And before I introduce my guest today, I want to actually thank Rabbi David Rosen because he was the first one that I contacted for this interview, but he was kind enough to tell me, Paula, I would love to talk to you, but there is someone else I think you should interview because he has a personal story. He actually didn't even say that, Rabbi. He actually said he has more experience with suicide, but he didn't tell me why. But I did some research and then I found out, and I'm so thankful he gave me your name, Rabbi. My guest today is Rabbi David Seth Kirshner. He's the rabbi of the Temple Emanu-El of Closter in New Jersey, but he also lost his brother to suicide, and his brother was quite young. I saw a video about you, Rabbi. Thank you so much for being here with us and talking about your loss, and also giving us an overview of how your religion sees suicide initiatives, how it deals with death and grief and all of these. So these are some of the topics that we're going to cover today. Thank you so much for being here with us.
I'm happy to be here with you and honored to talk a little bit about Judaism and this important topic of mental wellness and death by suicide. Just want to apologize to all your visual listeners. I'm enjoying some time off in Israel, and in Israel, it's a very laid-back country. So I'm just wearing a simple golf shirt and didn't get too dressed up. It's also later at night here. So thanks for allowing me to be casual.
Yes, what time is it there? It's a lot of 10-hour difference.
8:05 p.m. Yes.
Oh, 8:05 p.m. Okay, so it's not that, yeah. I think it was
10
10
hours
from.
between us and you. Yes.
Okay, well, thank you for talking to us late at night. Not that late, but late enough, I guess.
Not too late.
Yeah, so David, let's talk about your brother first. So what happened to him, and also how did it affect your family, and maybe, who knows, the way that you saw, because we know that the major religions, they see suicide as a sin, but many times when you go through this personal experience, you have to maybe rethink a little bit, which is, I'm sure, very hard for you because you have to stick to the tradition. So can you tell us a little bit about your brother's story? And I'm so sorry for your loss too. I'm sorry you had to go through this.
Thank you, Paula. My brother Gabriel died by suicide 25 years ago. Just hit the 25th anniversary just a few days ago, actually. Gabe was 36 years old when he died, and he was married with a little girl who was a little over 2 years old. Gabe had always been a little different, sometimes quirky, sometimes goofy, silly, had trouble with emotions, off the charts bright, very creative and innovative, had a lot of potential, didn't always maximize that potential. We learned a lot more about Gabe's challenges in his life after he died. And we knew that he battled issues of mental wellness. And one day in July of 1996, when all of the different foundations of his life seemed to be crumbling before him, he chose to end his life. And it was a day that forever changed my life and changed the lives of all of our family members. We learned later, much later, that Gabriel went to a boarding school, what's called a yeshiva, a Jewish day school, when he was a teenager from the ages of 13 to 15. And he was there with a bunch of other students of similar backgrounds to study. And there was a monster of a person there who had the title rabbi, who sexually molested and raped dozens upon dozens of the boys there, of which Gabriel was part of his prey. And what we are sure that happened is that Gabriel had his life raped from him, and then his body just died 21 years later. So that's Gabe's story in a very, very short, succinct way.
Yeah, I remember when I listened to your video and you said when he went to there is a name for it, the institution, the education institution. He said he
Yeshiva.
went yeshiva, yes, yeshiva. And when he came back, he wasn't the same. And I immediately thought about abuse, because as a therapist
Yeah.
we see this. When we hear
You
about a
know,
child changing all of a sudden, there is always something there.
and Paula, there are two parts that make that easier for us. One is hindsight. We always see better, retroactively when we read something, hear something, learn something. It gives us clearer vision. And in that time, in the 70s, early 70s, we weren't as dialed into those topics and emotional
Yeah.
wellness and expressing our feelings and the stigmas that came with it. It was a very, very different time.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't a time where we talked to people about their feelings and emotions and challenges. We couldn't talk to people about their sexuality. And if those things, were happening to people, it just created a space where they couldn't talk about it the same way that they can today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you said something that also took me back to your video and your testimonial. You said that his body died 21 years later. And I remember you saying something very similar about your father, that it was very, very hard for him. And like his soul died when Gabriel died, and then his body waited 20 years to die or something like that. So I
Those
wanted, yeah.
Yeah, 15. So my dad died 15 years after Gabe died, but he was never the same person after
Mm,
Gabriel died. My mom, you know, my mother chose to fortify herself and help others with advocacy and support and awareness as best as she could. My father just couldn't. And I don't fault either of them for their reactions. I think they're both
mhm,
normal approaches and reactions. And we've seen that throughout moments of trauma, tragedy, challenge, where some people embrace a certain direction and some people reject it. We saw after the Holocaust that countless Jews got
mm,
closer to God, and a whole group of Jews didn't believe in God anymore. And
mhm.
who am I to question either of those paths of faith?
Yeah.
But my father was someone who just was never the same. He was just a shell of who he was after Gabriel's death.
What about you? How did that affect you?
Well, I was a whopping 22 years old when it happened.
Hmm.
I was in rabbinical school. I was ironically in Israel when I got the phone call. I remember getting the phone call, and it was clear from a friend of mine who told me I needed to call home that it was a grave situation. I had no clue what the situation was, but the idea that I had to call home was serious and significant.
Hmm.
And I remember saying to myself, okay, one of my parents must have died. And whoever answers the phone, the other one will have been dead. Right. So if my mother answers the phone, my father died. If my father answers the phone, my mother died.
Yeah.
I got to find out this news, because that's the natural occurrence in life. You think that you're supposed to lose a
Hmm.
parent, and hopefully not so early, but that's kind of what you think will happen. And I was totally flummoxed because they both answered the phone at the same time when I called.
Mm.
And then they told me the news, and I came home, and it was just it just changed me dramatically. I think it was a not only a maturation, but just a stern wake up call about what matters the most in life. My parents were living by themselves. Obviously, all their kids were emptied out of the nest, and I spent a significant amount of time looking after them. I packed up Gabriel's belongings from his home in California and sent his wife and daughter on their way to relocate in Michigan. And
Hmm.
was very, very busy and active in just so many different parts of trying to keep other parts of our family afloat during that time. And then when it finally hit me, it just was a tremendous burden emotionally, physically. It was really, really hard time
Hmm.
to process, to deal with. It was very, very challenging.
Did you go through all the what ifs that is very common for us who lose a loved one to suicide?
Yes. And I had a really good therapist, and I went through a few of them. But the
Mm-hmm.
therapist who said, you can play this game until you're nauseous. It's not going to change a thing,
Yeah.
because you can't unring a bell. You can't go back in time. You can't fix the situation, and you can be better prepared for the future. And the truth is that, well, all of us like had blind spots, my brothers, my parents, myself, and his spouse, like we weren't hyper prepared for this. This is not something we thought was going to happen. This is not a phone call where we said, oh, well, we knew this was going to happen. There were 6 tries, or he was battling this for 20 years. Like
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't like that. But I think, that's what murdered my father too, is that he just wrestled with this guilt and regret and what
Yeah.
if, and if I had replayed this hand, if we'd done this way. And that's a very common thing. And I think lots of people who have lost a loved one to suicide do that. And my counsel to them would be, don't. That it's normal, it's common to think that way, but A, it's not healthy, B, it's not going to change fate, and C, you can only look forward, and you can learn the skills that you've learned, the reactions you've learned for anyone else who might be battling. But it's not going to change a thing now, number one. And number two is, if we were so keenly aware, then we would have done everything we could to stop this. And I don't think it helps in the process of dealing with the grief of suicide to add more grief to ourselves. It's
Yeah.
painful enough.
Yes, and not only add grief, but there is a lot of blaming too. When you start all these questions, what if and whys, you usually, and that's human too, who is responsible, right? And we see that a lot from communities towards the family. I mean, how could they not have seen that?
So, Paula, when we found out that um, Gabriel was abused and raped at this
Mm.
yeshiva by this monster, we thought that it would relieve some of our pain. And the
Mm.
truth is, it didn't. Right? It gave us a
Mhm.
finger or direction to point in, like where was the source of the fire? Was it electrical? Was it from the kitchen? Like, but it still burns down the house. Doesn't really matter. Okay, so you
Mhm.
found the source. Big deal. Who cares at that point if the source of the fire was electrical or from the stovetop or from a match? The result is the same. And that level of blame of who was responsible didn't give us one day of comfort, solace, relief. I wish I had known that Gabriel had gone through that, so that I could have been
Mhm.
sensitized or could have created an environment to allow him to talk about it if he wanted to, and to know that I was a safe person to discuss this with, and that my love was unconditional. But I
Mhm.
wish that's a
Mhm.
regret I have. But the blame will not change a thing.
Mhm. Mhm. Did you feel a lot of anger too, especially when you found out? And because that's another very common. And from my experience, I think that's where families get stuck the most, is the anger. And it's really hard to move from there. Did it happen?
So I know that Kubler-Ross comes up with one cycle of stage. I refer to the stages as SARA, which stand for shock, anger, resentment, and acceptance. I think that happens in a micro and in a macro.
Mm-hmm.
And someone said, when did you stop getting angry over Gabe's death? And I said, when it happens, I'll let you know.
Mm.
And when I get over the shock of it, I'll let you know. When I get over the resentment, I'll let you know. When I get to the acceptance, I'll let you know. I think I go through all of these in different ways in
Mm.
different times. And I think people
Yeah.
do. There's no timeline on this
No.
process. There's no
No. No.
timeline, and everyone's timeline is different.
Mm-hmm.
So feeling angry is normal and okay. Feeling resentful is angry and okay. Feeling sad is angry and okay. Um, Feeling, upset at yourself is okay and normal. But no one should feel any of those feelings to a point where I think it paralyzes them and their thought processes.
Mm-hmm. How did it affect your relationship with your parents, for example? Because your father, you say that he kind of shut down a little bit. Your mom, she engaged in advocacy, and so did you after a while, right? But did you talk about
Yeah.
it within your family, for example?
So the interesting thing about our family is that when Gabe died by suicide, um, we didn't stop. Let me re-say that. We didn't hide the nature of his death from anybody. For a lot of people, especially in a generation of my parents, to say someone died by suicide had its own stigma attached to it. So they would say, "Oh, he was badly, he was ill, or it was an accident, something happened." My parents
Mm-hmm.
didn't do that, much to their credit. He died by suicide, and it was recognized and announced. So that's number one. And I give them a lot of credit because today we can say that a little bit more freely, but 25 years ago and from the generation my parents were from, that was not something you could say freely. So I give them the credit for that courage. So we've been open about it to anyone who's asked from the get-go, and I think that that has helped in addressing issues of mental wellness. That's number one. Number two, it made our family incredibly close. We were close before,
Mm.
brought it to a whole different level. We never finished phone calls without saying, "I love you." We didn't
Mm.
let any issues fester. We went out of our way to spend time with each other. We didn't miss any calendrical events, whether it was a bar mitzvah, a birthday, a wedding, these things. We went out of our way to be there because it really, the phrase I like to use is it defibrillated us into the things that matter the most.
Mhm.
So that's what happened and how it happened. And it was very, meaningful and satisfying and part of the beauty of what happened, in that process.
Mhm. Let's talk about your religion and suicide. How does it view, and for you as a rabbi in a very religious family, how was it conflicting for you? Because it's a sin, isn't it, for Judaism?
So it wasn't conflicting for me whatsoever. Um, in fact, it felt like Judaism had the right answers for me. So for the last 100+ years, Judaism has treated the issue of death by suicide similarly to the way that Judaism has treated death by cancer. And that is that suicide is a result of a mental illness, that someone is unhealthy and unwell and causes them to take their life. And there used to be a time more than 100 years ago where people who died by suicide were buried in the outskirts of the cemetery. It wasn't discussed. It was a source of embarrassment. It was considered a sin. But today, in all the major streams of Judaism, the major streams, not the extremes, um, there is a sense of compassion, empathy, and understanding for not only the victims of suicide, but the survivors, the family members of suicide, for the means of which they died through mental unwellness. So for me, I didn't feel any sense of conflict as a conservative Jew. For your listeners who are unaware of the different streams of Judaism, conservative when it comes to Judaism is nothing like what the word conservative means when it comes to politics. Conservative is literally down the middle of the road. We are not reform and we are not orthodox. We are somewhere in the middle. We marry modernity to Jewish tradition and try and keep our feet planted in both of those worlds.
I'm so glad you talked about that because the word conservative usually, yeah, as you said, we assign it to politics, right? It's all conservative, so that's orthodox, right? Is that the same? So I'm really glad you clarify that. And yeah, I remember you saying that mental wellness is a value in Judaism. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. So in Judaism, there is one ideal, one law, one concept that is paramount. And that is pikuach nefesh dochet Shabbat. The idea of saving a life or looking after our own health and wellness is paramount. There's nothing above it in Judaism. Our responsibility to look after the lives of ourselves and lives of other people who might be in peril matters the most. That's why we are allowed, if we are, let's say, physicians or first responders, to forego prayer on the Sabbath or even on the holiest day of Yom Kippur if we're in the process of supporting someone else's life, right? the doctors at the hospital in Israel have to work on Yom Kippur, and they are exempt from prayer because they're in the midst of saving lives. The same thing for the police and the military and those pieces, because they're in the process of saving lives. So in Judaism, saving our life is a value. That's number one. Number two, when we say a get well prayer for people in Judaism, which is said anytime we want, but most prominently on the Sabbath, on Shabbat, we say a line, refuat nefesh, refuat guf, that we pray that God looks after their healing emotionally and physically. That we are aware that there are two different parts of us of how we feel. There are times where my body was 100% and I was in a deep depression, and times where I was feeling great, but my body wasn't. And you need both of those parts to be in sync. And Judaism recognizes that, it encourages it. And for us, it is paramount to see that our health and the health of others is always being sought after.
So it takes mental health into consideration too.
Mental wealth is as intrinsic to all over well-being as anything else is connected one to the other. Meaning you can't say they're fine because they're healthy without well-being. In Judaism, it is all, whoa, I lost you for a second. You there?
Sorry. Yeah, I'm here. You're back.
I'm sorry. Yes, okay. I'm sorry. Mental wellness is as well important and well-being as physical wellness in every component of Judaism.
Okay. Rabbi Kirshner, I want to talk about two beautiful sermons that I was happy and so glad to be able to see it online, because it's online and I'll have on my notes all the links to these sermons. But you had two that I think can serve as skills to my listeners, those who are grieving the loss of a loved one, or if you are in crisis and contemplating suicide, because it can apply to any one of us, to all of us. One of them talks about writing the book of your life. And I love how existential it is. Existential in the sense that it talks about how we are responsible for our lives. And one of the things you said was, do not submit to God and say it's in God's hands. What's in God's hands is the pain that he gives to us, but we are the ones who write the book of our lives. So can you talk a little bit about that? I absolutely love that message.
It's very, very kind of you. I'm impressed that you watched it, and I'm trying to jog my memory as to what I said. that brought that about. I think it was a handful of years ago. I had COVID, by the way. I did not have very serious effects of COVID. I wasn't sick. I wasn't laid up. I wasn't hospitalized. I had a small cough for a few days, but it has affected my memory in the most significant ways.
Really?
So yeah.
Wow. It just shows how weird this disease is, huh?
This disease is very strange. I used to remember anything and everything. I could tell you, when I saw a friend who I haven't seen for 23 years, what color their shirt they had on last time I saw them. And it has affected my memory a little bit, so I apologize. But I do remember the sermon. The sermon was given on Yom Kippur a handful of years ago. And it was because I had just finished reading two different books. One is when the book was called When Breath Becomes Air, and the other book was No Small Place for Dreams, or No Small Dreams, I think. One was Shimon Peres, and the other one was a physician who was diagnosed with a terminal cancer and died. And they were both powerful, beautiful books, very different topics. But the powerful part of their books was that neither authors of these biographies could finish their books. They died before they finished.
Wow.
And what happened was other people who were part of their family who loved them had to finish their books. So the question then becomes, what are people going to write about us? What are they going to say about us? What are those chapters going to read, and what do they look like? And at least I think, and I hope that's the sermon in which you're referring to. If not, I could point you to that one too. But I do think that that's really, really important. And I think the idea of not letting God decide all of those moments of faith, but creating our own fate, and realizing that God isn't in charge of whether we will, be happy or be sad, or how long these pieces that are just so emotional in nature. It's really up to us to create those moments and to make a difference. Pope Francis had this beautiful line that I have quoted hundreds of times. He said, "We pray to God for compassion, and then we hug the person who's crying. We pray to God for healing, and then we bring soup to those who are ill. We pray to God for love, and we give our hearts to those who are in need." That's what prayer is.
Wow, that's
And that to
beautiful.
me, it's beautiful. And that to me is the most beautiful explanation of what Judaism calls on each of us to do. And that is, don't turn to God and say, why did this person die? And why did they suffer from mental wellness? And why did this person have luck? And that's a fruitless conversation. It's, what can we do for others who are suffering with these challenges? And what can we do to give support to those who have gone through it, and to ensure that it happens less and less often by the tools and support systems and infrastructure that we bring to the equation.
Yeah. And you also talked about continuity. When you write the book of your life, you are also finishing somebody else's book. And then you
That is
ask that
correct.
question that you mentioned. I mean, who is going to finish your book, and what are the values that you're going to leave behind? Because that's what's going to be written, right? That's the main message of the book of your life.
Let me tell you, another sermon I gave a long time ago was that what matters most that you leave to your children are your values and not your valuables. When my father died 10 years ago, my father died 10 years ago, and there were a handful of things of his that I had wanted.
Mm-hmm.
Tchotchkes, things from his wallet, particular clothing, pictures, a handful of things. And I have those things in a special place for me. But what I think about all the time are the lessons he taught me, the little quips and the values and the teachings. That's what stays with you. And that's what it means when it says leaving values and not valuables. And by the way, all the things that I had kept that were important to me from his life were of zero value, right? You wouldn't get more than $3 for all of them together in eBay, but to me, they were priceless.
Sentimental value, right?
That is correct. That's the word I'm looking for. That's
Yeah.
correct.
It had some value added to the valuable. That's
Correct.
what matters. Yes.
That's
And
correct.
yeah, you talked about when you talked about, you always pass on that pen so that someone else writes about you. And I made me think about the book that I wrote about my father, right? And same thing.
Pass on the pen, and Paula, don't forget, live a life so that they write a book the way you want. I had a
Mm-hmm.
family member, he was a distant family member, who asked two things of me. He said, I want you to officiate at my funeral. Thank God he's still alive and well. He said this a handful of years ago. He goes, and I want to write my eulogy. And I said to him that in Judaism, you're forbidden to write your own eulogy.
Oh, really?
It's
I
actually
didn't
a
know
rule.
that.
Yeah.
Oh,
And the reason behind that is because you're supposed to live your life in a way that others say what they're supposed to say about you, not what you're supposed to say about you.
yeah, yeah.
And it's one of the most unknown yet potent and beautiful lessons in Judaism. And you need to live your life in a way so that those who are going to finish your story finish it in a way that'll be satisfying to you. And if it's not, then this is the
Yeah,
time to make those changes and adjustments.
yeah. You actually wrote about this. You said, we want to leave clear messages on straight lines for those who care enough to read our story. So, see?
That was good.
That was good, huh? Is that one of those moments when you say, did I say that?
I have to tell you, I'm doing editing of some of my writing here right now while I'm in Israel. And I'm like, did I write that? That's stupid. I can't believe I wrote that. Did I say that? That's
I
so
know.
silly. So that one sounded okay. I'll stick with that one.
Yeah, okay. I'll keep that. I'll keep that on my notes. Okay.
Yes.
And you're talking about values and your father, and it made me think of, I mean, the value that, as you said, back then it was a stigma. Nobody talked about suicide, but he was truthful to your brother, right? He said, no, this is what happened, was not an accident. It wasn't because of this or that. That's what happened, suicide. And the same thing happened to my family. We never hid it from anyone. Some people tried. I heard from friends, don't say that word in public. I actually heard that. And I said, no, listen, you have the problem with the word. We don't. It was suicide.
So I'm going to tell you two quick things about that, if I may. So when we started telling people, or if they asked, we would share with people that Gabriel died by suicide. it opened up a portal, a doorway for countless people who've been through the same thing.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to meet somebody who hasn't dealt with this in some level or another in their familial orbit. So by sharing it and putting it on your sleeve, so to speak, wearing it on your chest, you open up and tell people who you are, what you're about, and it allows them that comfort too. Because if you are with another person who lost a loved one to suicide, you automatically share a language. You share a handshake. You are part of the same sorority and fraternity. So knowing that there are other members of that sorority and fraternity make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
My very first sermon as the rabbi of Temple Emanu-El, not a visiting rabbi, but the rabbi of Temple Emanu-El, was about Gabriel and about his death by
Oh.
suicide and about what he had gone through as a victim of abuse. And I gave that sermon most likely unconsciously because I was 33 years old when I became the senior rabbi at Temple Emanu-El. I gave it because I wanted everyone to know that the rabbi you're about to get is a guy who's gone through stuff too.
Mm.
And what you are dealing with in your life, whatever it may be, I've dealt with stuff in my life. You can come to me. We can talk. I'm
Wow. That
just like
opened
all
the
of you.
door. Opened the
And
door.
what was most amazing to me after that sermon is how many people came knocking on the door saying that they had some connective tissue to either suicide, mental unwellness, other issues. And that was a big issue. It's a big issue, and it's one that no one is immune to.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's critical to be open about it and to show that level of courage, because once you're open, it makes it so much easier, to find that common bond with others. I'm not comparing what I'm about to share. I'm not saying that these are apples to apples, but this
Mm-hmm.
was the approach of Harvey Milk also. His idea and his methodology was that if he got more and more people to come out, that people would say, this person is my cousin, my brother, my uncle. And if
Mm-hmm.
they come out as gay and I love them, then I can say I love people who are gay and I can clear the stigma related to homophobia. And it's the same concept in a
Mm-hmm.
totally different atmosphere.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and you broke in a way. You're a leader, you're a rabbi, and in a position of authority, but you broke that wall of, here's my life is different from yours, and you stay there because I'm here as an authority leader of the religion. So I'm sure that made a huge difference to your community.
I hope so. It allowed us to be candid, to be forthright, to be, and I say this in the most appropriate way, to be naked with each other and to say our challenges are ones that we can share, because we can't grow if we can't be honest.
Mm-hmm. Let's keep going. I want to talk about the second sermon that I listened, and I also was very touched by it. It talks about how we tend, and I don't think it's ever been so true, especially after COVID, how we tend to stick to the negative. We have 99, I read this somewhere. Humans have 99%, but we stick to the 1%, right? We're always wanting more. And not only that, there's nothing wrong in wanting more, but we don't see what we have. We don't appreciate it. There's no gratitude for what we have. And that really touched me, because I think within the last year, with all the negativism, with all the division, I mean, here in the US, and you know this, you in Jerusalem now, but you live here, the division, the political division, and all the news. And it was just heartbreaking. I had to stop watching the news. And as a previous journalist, that was a hard decision to make, but I just had to. But I want to hear you talk about this. And actually, one of the things that really moved me in the sermon was you talking about yourself, because you realized at some point, because someone pointed it out to you, a friend, I don't know who, but someone said, why do you always see the negative? Why can't you just see what the positive in your life? You always stick to what's missing. I think that was what the person said to you, and that made you self-reflect and make some changes in your life. So can you talk about that, please? Because I think for my audience, this is so crucial. A lot of people stuck on their grief, and we have phases, we know that, but it is important to also see what you have in your life, and also for those who are in crisis, right?
Yes, there was in that sermon, I started with a comedian who has since gotten himself into some significant trouble. So I won't use his name, but he does this bit about how he's sitting on an airplane traveling overseas, and the guy next to him is on his computer, and the flight attendant makes an announcement that the Wi-Fi is out. And the guy on the computer goes, "This is, he's expletive. This is terrible." And the comedian says to him, he goes, let me get this straight. You're sitting on a 500-ton machine flying 40,000 feet above the land, going, in 8 hours from one continent to another. They're serving you hot food and champagne, and you're mad because you can't connect to the Wi-Fi. Like, where is your perspective? And I think about that line all the time. What doesn't work and what's broken? But so much is right in life. Many people in the world that I'm a part of will have a child come home with a 97, and they'll say to the child, "Well, what did you get wrong? Did you go over your mistakes with the teacher?"
God.
And even the nature of, did you go over your mistakes with the teacher so you can know what you didn't know, really underscores this idea of like, what about all that they got right? And I think that that's a bit of a microcosm for us about how it is that we focus on the negatives. In Judaism, we're supposed to say 100 blessings every day. That's the idea. Every day we should say 100 blessings. So if, as an observant Jew, I pray 3 times a day, I'd get pretty close to that just by the canonized part of the prayer. But what about just stopping literally as I walk down the street in Jerusalem and I see pomegranates that are budding, that will be ripe just in time for the holiday of Rosh Hashanah, or I smell sweet fragrance, or I see a young boy helping an elderly person across the street, and I just see the beautiful parts of what is the world, or I see, the reflection of the sun against the golden, stone of a building, and you realize how much in life is right, how much in life is actually working. And we take that all for granted far too often. In Judaism, one of the most beautiful blessings that we say is a blessing that we say in the morning, and then we say it every time we relieve ourselves in the bathroom. And it's called Asher Yatzar. And what it means is, thank you, God, for creating us and fashioning us in the way in which you have, and making all of these little canals and openings and tubes in just the perfect manner, that if anything that's supposed to be open becomes shut, and anything that's supposed to be shut becomes open, we can't do our job in being better people to you, God. Mm-hmm. And if you ever want to realize how much in life is right, get a kidney stone, right? Get sick, get sick, and realize that little tiny little dot, what the pain it can do and what challenges it can offer. And it's a real moment to give us all appreciation and blessing. Now, COVID has been a really hard time for our entire world, but there have been tremendous blessings within the moment of COVID, and some of it is realizing the blessings that surround us. How many people were able to recognize that they have shelter, that they have some income, that they can eat, that they're with the people they love, that that in and of itself is a blessing. And I do think that we do need to spend a lot more time counting our blessings, recognizing our good, taking stock in what is right, as opposed to only focusing on what's broken. I mean, we've come a long way. We seem to be a people that focus on the broken, but we need to realize all that we've done that's great.
I want to stay here because I was just thinking of how hard and the gap between the theory and reality. So you had a friend, you're a rabbi, you do this prayer every day, you count your blessings, but still you had a friend who came to you and said, why can't you see the positive? So I wanted to give your own perspective on that self-reflection, and how did you change? What were the behaviors that you had to change so that my listeners can learn from you?
So first of all, I think I do a decent job as a rabbi, so that when people come to me and they're having trouble with all that's broken, I can tell them all that's right, and to get that perspective. It's a very hard thing to do for myself, right? I mean, I think that that's a normal thing. That's why therapists have therapists and rabbis have rabbis, because, we're still human beings. We still struggle with things that are hard for us, and it's only natural at times. We are not deities. We are not perfect things. And while we might give sage, thoughtful, and helpful advice to people who are in times of crisis or in need, doesn't mean that we always give it to ourselves perfectly. So that's number one. And I indeed am a human being who makes mistakes. And there are times in my life where I can be negative, where I can see things are just broken too much, or feel that way. And if you're open to, first of all, if you're blessed like I am to have relationships with your loved ones and with your friends who you know can talk to you in a way where they can say something that might sting, but you don't have to question their love, because if they didn't love you, they wouldn't share that with you. And then you can realize that through that sting, you can grow. That's a blessing. So that's number one, right? Number two is, it's easy to diagnose what's wrong. That's the easy part.
Yeah.
Fixing it is the hard part. So don't think that just because we've established what is a challenge for us, that therefore we can just move forward. All of us, if we take the proper steps forward and recognizing the blessings that are around us, it works. I would encourage your listeners, and anyone for that matter, take a journal, make a blessing journal, write 10 things down every day that you are taking for granted, that you've taken for granted that you don't want to, just 10. And then the next day, do it again and try not to have any repeats. And then I want you to spend 2 minutes a day, 2 minutes out of all the minutes in the day, spend 2 minutes doing something that you've never done before that's a new thing for you. Maybe you'll enjoy it, maybe you won't. But, for a guy like me who's always running 200 miles per hour and trying to fit as much in as to the time I can, the idea of sitting on a bench outside for 2 minutes eating an ice cream, that's manna from heaven. That's a gift. And everyone has something different that they can do and they should do. And that makes you realize and take stock in the blessings that's around you.
But it takes work, doesn't it? And it's a daily work, and it should never stop. I remember you mentioned an example, I think, of your wife would go to the supermarket and you'd give her a list of 10 things. She wouldn't bring one, and that's all you focused on. But
Correct.
that's the work you have to do. Okay, why am I focusing on this one and not the 9? Right?
That's correct. That is correct.
Yeah, we often hear this. I hear this from my clients sometimes. They come to an insight, right? Wow, I had never noticed that I do that. Okay, but then what? Right? What do I do next? Now I know that that's what I do, but how do I get rid of it? How do I change that? And that's the challenge, and it's an ongoing challenge. It's not, but be aware. Be aware is think about the things that you have, right, and reflect on it.
That is correct. And the change won't happen overnight, and you can't make the change as a drastic overhaul. Baby steps.
Okay.
Baby steps.
Baby steps. Last question. Are you happy with the book that you're writing of your life?
That's a great question. And I'm really appreciative and I don't want to say proud, thoughtful, thankful that you're asking me that question, because I'm normally the one asking those kinds of questions. So it's really nice that you're asking me. To dovetail on what we were just talking about, there's a part of me that would say, oh, there's so much I want more to be doing, so much I wish I were doing, so much I wish could happen. And there's a part of me that sees, untapped potential that would frustrate me. And then I pause and I realize that I would be the envy of many people in the life that I have, the children that I have, the blessing and the spouse that I have, and all the blessings that I too often take for granted. So I think my answer to you would be, I'm happy with the book that I'm writing, but it's far from finished. And there are a lot of chapters ahead and a lot of work to be done, and places and things I hope to do that will leave a lasting impact to my community and to my family. I hope.
So stick to your values, right? That
I
should
hope
gear
so.
you in the right direction. Rabbi, I want to end by reading one more sentence from you. You said, we can only hope that we live a life that is good and right, so that the pages we write reflect the values and morals that we live and strive for each day. So I hope you continue your beautiful work, your advocacy, talking about mental illness, opening up about suicide. Thank you so much for your time with us.
Paula, thank you for the holy work that you're doing, and to your listeners. And I hope that all of us are doing our part to make our world a better, holier place.